In early 2026, a shipment of advanced chips left a facility in Hsinchu, bound for what appeared to be a legitimate buyer, then moved through a chain of shell companies and arrived powering artificial intelligence servers inside China. That single transaction is now forcing Taiwan to draft its own export control law, independent of Washington, because the alternative is American sanctions on the world's most important chip maker. The bullish case says Taiwan is finally acting as a sovereign industrial power. The skeptical case says the chip maker is so structurally embedded in both economies that any move it makes destroys something it cannot rebuild. 3 rounds determine which reading survives contact with the evidence. The protagonist here is not a policy document or a diplomatic signal. Physical cluster of fabrication plants in Hsinchu and Tainan, whose output represents, by most supply chain estimates, roughly 90% of the world's leading-edge logic chips by volume. That concentration is the contested ground. Every round returns to the same question. Does that concentration give Taiwan power, or does it make Taiwan a target? The structure of the contest is clear before the first piece of evidence lands. On one side, a case that the chipmaker holds irreplaceable leverage over 2 superpowers simultaneously. On the other, a case that being irreplaceable to adversaries is not the same as being free to act. 3 rounds, then a decisive fourth, settle which framing is closer to honest. The first fire is the revenue dependency that makes neutrality structurally impossible. The commercial case for maintaining access to Chinese customers has always been straightforward. Fabless chip designers, cloud hardware integrators, and consumer electronics buyers historically represented a meaningful double-digit percentage of annual revenue for the Taiwanese foundry. By analyst estimates tracking the broader supply chain, though the foundry does not disaggregate its revenue by end customer country in a way that isolates the exposure cleanly. That share has declined since United States controls tightened in 2022 and 2023. But the baseline was high enough that the decline still leaves a significant dependency. The counterclaim is that the American relationship is not just a customer relationship. United States equipment suppliers provide the tooling that runs inside the Hsinchu fabs. American intellectual property licenses underwrite process development. The incentives supporting the Arizona expansion flow through Washington's goodwill, and those fabs require continued United States export licenses for the equipment already installed inside them. American access does not cost customers. It ends the foundry's ability to stay at the frontier of process development, which is the only place it has a franchise. Both dependencies are structural, not marginal. Neither can be shed quickly. Round 1 to the skeptics. The trap is real and symmetric. The chipmaker cannot absorb losing either relationship, which means the language of choice is misleading. What looks like a strategic decision is actually a forced move, with guaranteed damage on whichever side absorbs the impact. The second fire is the one that made the choice unavoidable rather than theoretical. The bullish framing of the shell company problem runs like this. Chinese companies develop sophisticated procurement networks, layered intermediaries, front companies registered in third countries, falsified end-user certificates, specifically to acquire advanced chips despite restrictions. That persistence proves demand is inelastic. Willing to absorb that much friction and legal exposure to reach a product is a buyer who has no substitute. Inelastic demand, the argument goes, is leverage for the seller. The counterclaim dismantles that reading. The same procurement networks are the reason Taiwan is now under pressure to legislate. The United States signaled, with increasing directness through 2025 and into 2026, that if chips originating in Taiwan keep arriving inside restricted Chinese entities through whatever intermediary channel, the origin country becomes part of the compliance problem. Leverage evaporates the moment the foundry is treated as a conduit rather than a supplier. Taiwan's Ministry of Economic Affairs confirmed in early 2026 that it was reviewing export control legislation partly in response to documented cases of advanced chips reaching Chinese buyers through intermediary entities. His own public statements acknowledged enhanced end-user verification requirements put in place since late 2023. No comprehensive independent audit of the full diversion volume has been published, but the political response is itself evidence. Governments do not draft new export control laws in response to problems that have not crossed a threshold they can no longer ignore. Round 2 goes to neither side cleanly, but the structure favors the skeptics. The smuggling proved the chips are irreplaceable enough to root around restrictions. It also handed Washington a compliance lever that Taipei cannot afford to dismiss. The leverage runs in both directions, and that is categorically different from the chipmaker holding it. The third fire is the legislative gambit Taiwan is now running. By drafting its own export control framework rather than simply mirroring United States rules, Taiwan is attempting a narrow threading of the needle, designed to demonstrate compliance credibility to Washington, while retaining some Taiwanese discretion over which buyers get cut and which do not. On the bullish reading, this is Taiwan behaving as a strategic actor, not merely a geography that hosts semiconductor plants. The counterclaim is blunt. Sovereign law works only when it is enforced with resources Taiwan has not historically deployed for export control. The shell company networks that already defeated the foundry's internal compliance will not be stopped by a new ministry checklist. And if the law closely tracks the United States entity list logic, it effectively outsources the decision back to Washington while layering Taiwanese legal liability on top. This draft legislation, as reported through mid-2026, would establish export licensing requirements for advanced semiconductor technology broadly consistent with United States restrictions, though final parameters had not been confirmed in independently reviewed public documents at the time of this analysis. Industry groups in Taiwan raised concerns about the compliance burden on smaller chip design houses. That internal friction is a tell. A law contested domestically before it is tested externally has not yet become a supply chain control. Round 3 to the skeptics. Narrowly. A law is a signal, not a physical barrier. Taiwan's move matters diplomatically, but its effect on actual chip flows depends on enforcement infrastructure that does not yet visibly exist. The decisive question is whether the foundry can escape the structure entirely through geographic diversification. The bullish case on trajectory points to real capital allocation. Arizona fabs are under construction. In Japan represent a further geographic distribution of production. As those come online and China-linked revenue continues declining as a share of total, the exposure gradually compresses. The company transitions from hostage to hedged, still exposed, but not existentially so. The path is visible in the spending patterns. Here is where the dissent deserves its full hearing, because the case for the opposite verdict has genuine weight. Every chip that routes around a restriction through a third country intermediary is evidence that the foundry's output is so singular that motivated buyers will absorb enormous friction to reach it. That inelasticity is leverage. Washington needs the foundry's cooperation precisely because there is no American fab that can replace its output at the leading edge. Beijing needs that output precisely because there is no Chinese fab that can replicate it at the geometries that matter for frontier artificial intelligence hardware. Both adversaries depend on is not trapped in the conventional sense. It is pivotal. Taiwan's new export control law on this reading is not capitulation to Washington. It is Taiwan collecting a compliance credential it can spend later, at a moment of its own choosing, in a negotiation with either side. That argument is coherent. The synthesis that overrules it is this: pivotal and trapped are not mutually exclusive conditions, and the evidence that the foundry matters to everyone is simultaneously the evidence that everyone is watching what it does, which constrains action more than obscurity ever could. The decisive round goes to the bullish case on trajectory and to the skeptical case on timeline. The leading-edge process node, the one that actually determines who can build frontier artificial intelligence accelerators, remains in Taiwan. Arizona's initial production runs on an older node. Advanced process will not move offshore at meaningful scale for years, if it moves at all. Fab diversification and leading-edge concentration are happening simultaneously, which means the chipmaker's irreplaceable core stays in the same geography even as peripheral production spreads. The contest that was supposed to be settled by export controls is now being settled by construction schedules, and those schedules are measured in years, not quarters. The analyst's verdict is not kind to any party. The foundry does not win this contest. Taiwan does not win this contest. Washington extracts the most value from the current structure because it secures compliance momentum. A sovereign Taiwanese export control law moving in the direction of United States policy without having to sanction an ally or absorb the supply shock of cutting the foundry off directly. Beijing loses access to leading-edge chips through official channels, but retains enough procurement infrastructure that the is throttled rather than absolute. The foundry absorbs real revenue cost, real compliance cost, and real geopolitical risk in exchange for continued access to the equipment and capital that keeps it at the frontier of process development. Survival is the outcome. Survival is also the ceiling. The restriction that was supposed to clarify who controls the foundry has instead clarified that no one does, and that the contest to get closest is the most expensive industrial fight of the decade. Round 2 is the one worth arguing with in the comments. If the shell company smuggling evidence actually demonstrates the foundry's leverage rather than its vulnerability, make that case directly, because that is the round where this verdict is most exposed to reversal. And if the next move in this contest belongs on this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the construction schedules and the compliance calendars are both running, and they are not running at the same speed.